Hey guys, it's Osby from Retro Moose. Now today on Retro Moose we're going to do something a little bit different. Normally we'll do video reviews of single games. Today we're going to cover an entire series. Why? Because I hate myself, that's why. We're going to look at an entire series of games that has really impacted me in my life. Now that is, I'm sure you could have guessed, is Final Fantasy. We're going to focus on Final Fantasy 1 through Final Fantasy 13. We're not going to talk about the MMOs or any of the spin-offs or any of the sequels or prequels. We're just going to focus on the numbers. So, let's get started. Final Fantasy 1.
Final Fantasy was developed and published in 1987 by Square. The story of Final Fantasy follows 4 youths known as the Warriors of Light, each of whom are carrying one of the 4 elemental orbs, which have been darkened by the 4 elemental fiends. With a heavy emphasis on grinding, Final Fantasy became one of the most influential and successful role-playing games on the Nintendo Entertainment System.
Final Fantasy 2.
Developed and published in 1988, Final Fantasy II's story centers on 4 youths whose parents were killed during an army invasion by the Empire of Palamecia. Final Fantasy II features gameplay very similar to its predecessor Final Fantasy, but it does introduce many elements that would later become staples of the Final Fantasy series, including chocobos and the reoccurring character Cid.
Final Fantasy 3.
Developed and published in 1990, Final Fantasy III's story revolves around 4 orphaned youths drawn to a crystal of light. While the gameplay is very similar to its predecessors, Final Fantasy III does introduce a job system. Any playable character in Final Fantasy III has access to every currently available job and can change from job to job at will.
Final Fantasy 4. Or Final Fantasy 2, depending on which country you live in.
Released in 1991, Final Fantasy IV's story follows Cecil, a dark knight, as he tries to prevent the sorcerer Golbez from seizing powerful crystals and destroying the world. Final Fantasy IV introduced innovations that became staples of the Final Fantasy series, such as the active time battle system. Unlike prior games in the series, Final Fantasy IV gave each character their own unchangeable character class.
Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. Final Fantasy V.
Developed and published in 1992, Final Fantasy V begins as a wanderer named Bartz investigates a fallen meteor. There, he encounters several characters, one of which whom reveals the danger facing the 4 crystals that control the world's elements. Final Fantasy V is often praised for the freedom of customization that the player has over the characters, achieved through the greatly expanded job system.
Final Fantasy VI. Or Final Fantasy III, because reasons.
Developed and published in 1994, Final Fantasy VI is set in a fantasy world with a technology level equivalent to that of the Second Industrial Revolution. The game focuses on a group of rebels as they seek to overthrow an imperial dictatorship. Final Fantasy VI features 14 permanent playable characters, the most of any game in the main series. Final Fantasy VI is highly regarded as one of the best Final Fantasy games in the entire series.
Final Fantasy VII.
Developed and published in 1997, Final Fantasy VII is the first game in the series to use 3D computer graphics, featuring fully rendered characters on pre-rendered backgrounds. The story follows Cloud Strife, a mercenary who joins the eco-terrorist rebel organization Avalanche, who is trying to stop the world-controlling megacorporation Shinra from draining the life of the planet to use as an energy source. Final Fantasy VII is easily my favorite game in the entire Final Fantasy series.
Final Fantasy VIII.
Developed and published in 1999, Final Fantasy VIII is the first game in the series to consistently use realistically proportioned 3D character models. The story follows a group of young mercenaries, led by Squall Lionheart, who are traveling to different countries to stop the sorceress Idea. Final Fantasy VIII is the first game in the series to introduce a trading card-based minigame called Triple Triad.
Final Fantasy IX.
Developed and published in the year 2000, Final Fantasy IX's plot centers on a war between nations. The story follows a young thief named Zidane, who joins with others to defeat Queen Braun of Alexandria. While developed alongside Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy IX took a different approach by returning to the more traditional style of early Final Fantasy games.
Final Fantasy X.
Developed and published in 2001, Final Fantasy X marks the Final Fantasy series transition from entirely pre-rendered backdrops to fully three-dimensional areas, and is also the first in the series to feature voice acting. Set in the fantasy world of Spira, the game's story revolves around a group of adventurers and their quest to defeat a rampaging monster known as Sin.
Final Fantasy XII.
Released in 2006, Final Fantasy XII takes place in the fictional land of Ivalice, where the empires of Arcadia and Rosaria are waging an endless war. Final Fantasy XII is the first in the series to feature a seamless battle system and a controllable camera. When I played Final Fantasy XII, it felt like I was playing a popular MMORPG, except I was playing by myself.
Final Fantasy XIII.
Final Fantasy XIII, or what I like to call Linear Fantasy XIII, was developed and published in 2009. The game takes place in the fictional floating world of Cocoon, whose government, the Sanctum, is ordering a purge of civilians who supposedly have come in contact with Pulse. Final Fantasy XIII focuses on fast-paced combat, and also introduces a customizable paradigm system to control which abilities are used by each character.
So there you have it, the entire Final Fantasy series. Now I hope you enjoyed this video, because I certainly enjoyed talking about Final Fantasy to each and every one of you, just like I enjoy playing Final Fantasy games in my free time. Now, in the future, we'll do a Final Fantasy spin-off video where we talk about some sequels, some prequels, some tactics games, and a few other obscure ones that you may not have heard of. For more videos just like this one, hit that subscribe button or visit retromoose.com.